Welcome back to the Book Nook, listener. It's good to be back with you. And today we're going to do something a little bit different. We often like to zoom in on specific events or policies, but I thought it might be interesting to take a step back today, kind of look at the underlying systems, the machinery of how societies work. And a book that really tackles this head on is Knowledge and Decisions by Thomas Sowell. I know a lot of you have been requesting this one, so we're excited to dive in with you.
Yeah, this is a classic. It's one of those books that, even though it was written a while ago, it still has so much to offer. And it really gets to the core of how information shapes our world. Like, how do we actually know what we know? And then how does that knowledge get used when we make decisions? So it tackles these questions on every level, from like everyday choices to big institutional decisions in government and economics.
So that's really our mission today, to pull out some of the key insights and arguments from Knowledge and Decisions, give you a framework for understanding how Sowell sees the world. You know how decisions get made in different systems, and it all boils down to this: the role of knowledge. How do we verify it? What trade-offs are involved? What are the implications for things like prices in the market or government regulations?
Yeah, let's just jump right in. So one of the first things Sal really hits on is the importance of knowledge in decision making. But it's not just about having information, it's about the quality of that information. And specifically how that knowledge gets authenticated. Like, how do we know if something is actually true? He distinguishes between knowledge that's been rigorously tested and validated and those just plausible sounding beliefs or speculation.
I think one of the best examples he uses is comparing a farm boy who knows how to milk a cow to a criminologist who's studying crime. Can you unpack that a little for us?
Sure. So the difference is in the feedback.
Yeah.
For the farm boy, the proof is in the pudding, right? Either there's milk in the pail or there isn't. His knowledge gets validated immediately and directly. But now think about the criminologist. They might spend years doing research, coming up with theories and interventions. But knowing whether their ideas actually work, whether they actually reduce crime, that's a lot more complicated. There's so many other factors involved, and the results are a lot less certain. So what Sal's getting at is that the more complex a system is, and the longer the feedback loops are, the harder it is to really know if our decisions are having the intended effect.
Right, it's not like flipping a switch and then seeing the results right away, especially in something like social science.
Exactly. And so we'll contrast this with the business world, where you have a very different kind of feedback loop.
Because the market is brutal.
It is. In the marketplace, if a business offers a product that people don't want, or if they price it wrong, they find out pretty quickly when nobody buys it. The financial outcomes provide very direct feedback.
No matter how good your intentions are.
Exactly. The market doesn't care about intentions, just results. And Sowell points out that this kind of clear-cut validation isn't always there in other areas, particularly intellectual fields.
Where the criteria for what's considered true can be a lot fuzzier.
Right, so in fields like social science or philosophy or even art criticism, ideas might be accepted based on how plausible they sound to certain groups or how well they align with certain ideologies. It's not always about being tested against concrete, measurable outcomes.
And this leads into his discussion of the term social construct, which we hear all the time now.
Yeah, and what he's cautioning against is dismissing all established knowledge as just a social construct, something that can be deconstructed without any consequences. He uses the example of eyesight to illustrate this point.
Which is so interesting because on one level, our vision is a construct, right?
It is. Our brains are processing and interpreting visual information all the time. It's influenced by our understanding of things like perspective and distance. But that doesn't mean that what we see is arbitrary or unreal. Sowell argues that our ability to navigate the world, to interact with physical objects, that's a constant form of validation. Just because our understanding of reality is constructed by our brains doesn't mean we can just redefine reality at will.
There are real-world consequences to our actions.
Exactly. There are constraints. Our understanding is built, but it's not arbitrary. So the danger he points out is when we start to treat genuinely constrained realities as if they were just malleable social constructs that we can just change with language.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So we've talked about how knowledge gets authenticated. Let's shift gears a bit and talk about how decisions actually get made. Sowell emphasizes that we need to focus on specific decision-making units rather than this vague idea of society making decisions.
I love that he does this because it forces you to think about the actual actors involved.
Instead of this amorphous blob called society.
Exactly. He says, if you really want to understand why certain choices are made, you need to look at the individuals, the businesses, the government agencies. Who's actually making those decisions? And what are the incentives and constraints that they're facing? Because if you just talk about what society wants or needs, you're often missing the real motivations and conflicts that are going on beneath the surface.
Right. So by breaking it down into these specific units, you can get a much clearer picture of the dynamics at play.
Absolutely. And it can lead to more effective solutions because you're targeting the actual points of leverage. Now, along with this idea of decision-making units, Sowell also argues that all choices involve trade-offs.
Yeah, there's no such thing as a free lunch.
Right. Every decision, whether it's personal or on a larger scale, involves giving something up. Even simple things, like choosing between two products or deciding how to spend your time, that involves a trade-off. And these trade-offs can be economic, obviously measurable in dollars and cents, but also social and political.
So social trade-offs might be things like convenience or tradition.
Exactly. Or even things like social cohesion or fairness. And political trade-offs involve balancing different interests and priorities within a society. And within these trade-offs is the concept of opportunity cost.
Now, this is a really important one for our listeners. Can you explain why?
So opportunity cost is the idea that the real cost of something isn't just the money you spend on it, but also the value of the next best alternative that you're giving up. Sowell uses the example of cheese to illustrate this.
Okay, so if you're buying cheese, what's the opportunity cost there?
Well, the resources that went into making that cheese, the milk, the labor, the factory space, those resources could have been used to make something else, like ice cream or powdered milk. So the opportunity cost of the cheese is the value of that ice cream or powdered milk that you're not getting. It forces you to think about the unseen consequences of your choices.
It's a really powerful way of looking at things. And Sowell also talks about how the number of options available can influence decision-making. Generally, he says more options are better.
Yeah, in most cases. Having a wider range of choices is good. It allows for more people to get what they want and need. But he does point out this interesting paradox. When it comes to large organizations,
What's that?
the idea that there could be diminishing returns to internal communication. So in a big organization, you might think that more information is always better, right? Keep everyone in the loop.
Make sure everyone's on the same page.
Exactly. But what can happen is that if there's too much communication, too many memos and emails and reports, people start to tune it out.
Yeah.
They can't process it all. So even though the intention is to improve communication, the effect can be that information gets lost in the noise.
It's like trying to drink from a fire hose.
Exactly. And what's interesting is that each individual sender of information,
Yeah.
they don't bear the full cost of that diminished attention across the organization. So their incentive is still to keep sending those emails, even if it's collectively counterproductive.
Interesting. Okay, so we've covered how we authenticate knowledge and the trade-offs involved in decision-making. Let's move to another core idea in Sowell's work, the role of prices in a free market.
Oh, this is where his analysis really shines. Sowell argues that prices are like this incredibly efficient and decentralized way of transmitting knowledge.
It's amazing when you think about it.
It really is, because every price tag you see is packed with information. It tells you about the relative scarcity of a good or service, and also the subjective value that millions of people place on it. And all of this allows for incredibly complex economic activity to happen without any central authority directing it.
It's like an invisible hand coordinating everything.
Exactly. And the beauty of it is that you don't even need to understand why a price has changed to respond to it rationally. So let's say there's a drought that affects wheat production. The price of bread goes up. Consumers see that and they might start buying less bread or switch to other grains, even if they have no idea why the price changed in the first place. They're still responding to the information that's embedded in the price.
That's such a good point. But what happens when governments try to interfere with these price signals? Sowell talks about the unintended consequences of things like rent control and minimum wage laws.
Yeah, and this is where things get really tricky, because often these interventions are meant to help people, protect tenants from high rents or ensure a living wage for workers. But what Sowell shows is that by distorting price signals, you can actually end up hurting the very people you're trying to help.
So how does that play out with rent control, for example?
Well, if you artificially cap rents below market levels, what you're doing is sending a false signal about the actual scarcity of housing in that area. So landlords have less incentive to maintain their properties or to build new ones because they're not going to make as much money. And in the long run, that can actually lead to a shortage of affordable housing because there's less supply and more demand.
So it's like you're trying to fix a leak, but you end up creating a bigger problem.
Exactly. And the same logic applies to minimum wage laws. If you set a minimum wage above the market rate, it can make it harder for businesses to hire workers, especially low-skilled workers, who might not be able to produce enough value to justify that wage. So again, you can have good intentions, but if you don't understand how prices work, you can end up with unintended consequences.
It really highlights the importance of thinking systemically. Sowell uses a really fascinating example to show how prices can guide resource allocation even without people knowing all the details. He talks about the discovery of new iron ore and how that can have ripple effects throughout the economy.
Oh yeah, that's a classic Sowell example.
Yeah.
So imagine you have this new discovery of iron ore, which might lead to lower steel prices. At the same time, maybe there's a shortage of trees, so the price of wood goes up. Now, furniture manufacturers, they don't necessarily know about the iron ore or the tree shortage, but they see that steel is now relatively cheaper compared to wood. So what do?
They start making more steel furniture.
Exactly. And consumers, they might not know about the underlying causes either, but they see that steel furniture is now more affordable. So they might choose that over the more expensive wooden furniture. And so the whole economy adjusts based on these price signals without anyone having to direct it from the top down.
It's amazing how it all works together. But of course, Sowell doesn't stop there. He also talks about the dangers of other kinds of government intervention beyond price controls. Things like forcible resource transfers and restrictions on competition.
Yeah, he argues that these types of interventions can also disrupt the efficient use of knowledge and lead to suboptimal outcomes. One example he gives is urban renewal projects, where communities are sometimes displaced to make way for new development.
Which often backfires and doesn't actually help the people it's supposed to.
Right, because you're overriding the decentralized knowledge of the people who actually live in those communities.
Yeah.
And he also had some interesting things to say about antitrust laws.
Which are meant to prevent monopolies and promote competition.
Exactly. But Sowell points out that sometimes antitrust actions are taken against companies that don't even have that much market share. So it raises the question of whether these interventions are always justified or if they might sometimes stifle innovation and efficiency in the name of promoting competition. You know, it's a reminder that even well-intentioned policies can have unintended consequences.
And he makes a similar point about regulations that are based on perceived need, like regulating airline routes based on the need for air travel in a certain area.
Yeah, because Sowell argues that need is often subjective and influenced by price. You know, if the government artificially lowers the cost of something like landing fees at an airport, it might create the appearance of a greater need for air travel that actually exists, and that can lead to wasted resources, like airlines flying planes with lots of empty seats.
So you end up with a system that's not really serving anyone's best interests. Okay, so we've talked about knowledge trade-offs prices. Now let's move on to another key element in Sowell's framework, incentives.
Oh, this is so crucial, because Sowell argues that people and organizations respond predictably to the incentives they face. So if you want to understand why people behave the way they do, you need to look at the incentives that are shaping their behavior.
And he uses the example of regulatory agencies to illustrate this point.
Yeah, he points out that there's often a revolving door between regulatory agencies and the industries they regulate. So regulators might have lower salaries than people working in the industry, and then they might leave their government jobs to take high-paying jobs in the very companies they used to oversee.
So there's a built-in incentive to be friendly to those companies.
Exactly. And it's not necessarily that these regulators are corrupt or malicious. It's just that the incentives are structured in a way that can lead to conflicts of interest.
It's about the system more than the individual.
Right. And Sowell argues that if you want to change behavior, you need to change the incentives. He also talks about how the time horizon for rewards and penalties can affect behavior.
Can you give an example of that?
Sure, he uses the example of the Soviet concept of storming in factories.
Mm-hmm.
So they often had monthly production quotas, and there was a huge incentive to push really hard at the end of the month to beat those quotas, even if it meant neglecting maintenance or overusing equipment. So the short-term reward of meeting the quota overshadowed the long-term cost to the factory.
Interesting. So you can end up with a system that's focused on meeting immediate targets, but not on long-term sustainability.
Exactly.
Mm.
And so Wells sees this dynamic playing out in many areas of life. Okay, so moving on. He also talks about this concept of sorting and labeling.
What's that all about?
So this is the idea that things like brand names and credit ratings and even social labels, they serve a function in society. They help us economize on information and make more efficient decisions.
So for example, a brand name can be a shortcut for quality.
Exactly. You know, if you see a brand you recognize, you don't have to research every single product from scratch. You have some expectation of what you're going to get. And a credit rating gives lenders a quick way to assess someone's creditworthiness. So these labels and categories, while they might not be perfect, They do help to streamline things and make transactions smoother.
It's about reducing the cognitive load of decision-making.
Right. And Sowell argues that even people who might be disadvantaged by these labels can still benefit from the overall efficiency that they create.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a zero-sum game.
Okay.
Okay, so now let's talk about Sowell's distinction between systemic analysis and what he calls animistic analysis.
What's the difference?
This is a really important point. So Sowell advocates for a systemic approach to understanding social phenomena, which means looking at the interconnected web of relationships, incentives, constraints, and the patterns that emerge from those interactions, instead of just attributing outcomes to the intentions of individuals, which he calls the animistic fallacy.
So it's like looking at the forest instead of just the trees.
Exactly. He argues that both ends of the political spectrum can fall into this trap. On the left, you might blame poverty on the greed of the rich. And on the right, you might blame poverty on the laziness of the poor. But Sowell says that both of those explanations are too simplistic. They don't take into account the complex systemic factors that contribute to poverty.
So it's about seeing the bigger picture.
Exactly. And he points to thinkers like Adam Smith and Karl Marx, who, despite their huge ideological differences, both employed more systemic mode of analysis. They were trying to understand the underlying structures of society.
That's a really interesting comparison. Okay, so moving towards the end of the book, Sowell also discusses the political role of intellectuals.
Yeah, he defines intellectuals as people whose main output is ideas. Writers, professors, journalists. And he argues that this group often favors centralized decision-making, and they tend to promote ideological visions that prioritize abstract principles over practical considerations or the diverse preferences of the population.
It's a provocative argument for sure.
It is. And finally, Sowell talks about the relationship between freedom and the growth of government.
This is a big one.
Yeah, he argues that the expansion of government power can actually erode individual freedom, not just through direct restrictions on behavior, but also by controlling more and more aspects of our lives, like healthcare, education, employment. When more and more decisions are made by government bureaucracies that are often insulated from individual preferences, it can shrink the sphere of individual autonomy.
So even if those government programs are well-intentioned.
Exactly. Sowell's point is that freedom should be defined broadly to encompass the ability of individuals to make their own choices in the important areas of their lives.
And that when the government makes those choices for us, even in the name of helping us, it can ultimately diminish our freedom.
Precisely. Well, listener, I think we've covered a lot of ground today, and we've only scratched the surface of knowledge and decisions.
It's an incredibly rich and thought-provoking book, and I hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of Sowell's framework for analyzing how societies work.
Yeah, his work really challenges us to think more critically about the role of knowledge incentives and the unintended consequences of our actions.
This is a book that really rewards multiple readings, and we encourage you to explore it further for yourself, see what resonates with you, what questions it raises, and as always, we'd love to hear your thoughts. So thanks for joining us in the Book Nook.
Thanks, listener.